Education for Life. We just wanted to say hi, welcome to this webinar. This is a free webinar which contains an introduction. It also has a reasonable amount of content which hopefully will be of benefit to you in regards to anxiety. It sort of underpins many of our reactions as humans. And then at the end, there's a really good value proposition, great value offer, which is time limited. So I'd love you to take advantage of that as well as we go through this. We'll be talking about that. But basically, yeah, my name is Ian Rumsey, and I'm a psychologist here in Sydney, Australia. And I've been practicing for over 10 years. And just a little bit of background to myself is that I completed a Bachelor of Science at Sydney University. It's one of our great universities here in Sydney, Australia. Also completed a Master of Arts in Psychology at Sydney Uni as well. Also did an Advanced Diploma in Leadership, and that's at a local college here in Sydney. A Certificate 3 in Disability Care at the Sunshine TAFE, that's up in Queensland. And also I've done a Certificate 4 Training and Assessor, which is also basically, putting together course content and doing assessment. And it's part of what we call our TAFE system here in Australia as well. So it's sort of a practical system. So that's some of my educational background. The other background I have is I've got 10 years of experience in the corporate sector. I've actually worked for Microsoft, IBM, and the Oracle Corporation, sort of in business roles, all the way from customer service to account management. So I've got a reasonable amount of corporate sector experience. Then I took a bit of a sea change in life and then spent the next 10 years in the community sector. And I worked specifically for a government department in Queensland called the Department of Communities, doing everything from being a carer with people with intellectual disabilities, all the way to then practicing psychology in that department. And so, yeah, done a reasonable amount of experience in there. So it's quite a big change from the corporate sector. And then 10 years as a psychologist in private practice. So, for the last 10 years, been practicing as a psychologist in Sydney, Australia. And for 3 years of those, actually 3 years, I was in the Gold Coast on the east coast of Australia as well, in private practice. And all up, added up about 10,000 hours plus of face-to-face appointments in psychology. So I've literally sat in front of people one-on-one for about 10,000 plus hours in those 10 years. And so that leads me to, that's a picture of me too. That's myself there. So why doing online courses? Why am I interested in online courses? Why are we doing this for Education for Life? And pretty much, myself and some colleagues were talking about this not too long ago, and we were thinking about how can we get good information in front of people that can really help them, because we did find ourselves, constantly repeating information inside sessions for good reasons, like people needed the information, and so we wanted to put that information out there in an online course kind of scenario. And the reason why is there's lots of people, for example, with anxiety issues, and a lot of the treatments for anxiety underpin certain scientific principles, which we think if we can get those principles into people's hands, it just can really help them manage their anxiety, really help them just in their day-to-day life, because anxiety itself can be quite an overwhelming experience. And we just wanted to put some of those practical things in place. And using the internet to do that, online course structures are fantastic. So there's a little bit of background of me. I'm also a dad. I have a great wife, beautiful wife, and we've got some kids as well. And so just a bit of background sort of personally as well. Definitely a family man, and looking forward to getting into this information today as well. And hopefully it really will help you. Just before we do that too, and this is something which we do with Education for Life across our courses and pretty much in front of all of our lectures, is just talk about a risk warning. And that I'll just describe a little bit, but you can pause this and read the whole thing if you'd like to. But just describing that this particular information we're giving is what we call psychoeducation. So it's not tailored specifically to your situations. So it's impossible as a psychologist to do any kind of treatment, any kind of therapy, unless we know your personal situation. So it's very important at the start of this lesson just to realize that this education that we're giving you is around psychology, and it's not at all a therapy session. So just really clear, succinct with that. The risk warning's there legally, and also just to protect you guys and us as well. So have a pause with that, have a read of the risk warning, and then we'll get into some of the content. So in this webinar, we're going to actually talk about the anatomy of anxiety and get into a bit of detail about it. But then also we're going to talk about anxiety first aid. So if you find yourself in an anxious state, regularly or reasonably regularly, how do you get out of it? What do you do from a kind of first aid point of view? And then also we're going to talk about that value proposition at the end of the webinar as well. So the question is, what is anxiety? What do the symptoms look like? So we're going to check that out. What's the anatomy of anxiety? So we're going to look at that. We're going to great illustration with the brain. And then we're going to talk about anxiety first aid there. And I've got a picture of Charlie Brown there with my anxieties, have anxieties. And he's sort of freaking out in the middle of the night there, which often is where anxiety hits, in the middle of the night as well. So it's just a great cartoon there. I love Charlie Brown there. So really, what is anxiety? So I'll start with the picture, because basically pictures say 1,000 words. And that that was a bad dad joke, by the way. Often when I'm in sessions with clients, they describe anxiety like a storm, like it feels like a storm, or waves of panic or fear that wash over them. And so the picture kind of describes, and I was trying to look for a picture, but basically a picture that often I use, even personally, is we have a Sydney to Hobart yacht race that happens every Christmas, Boxing Day, actually, around Boxing Day here in Sydney. It's a famous boat race where people sail from Sydney to Hobart, which is in the south. It's an island in the south of, in the island of Tasmania in the south of Australia. And so in this yacht race, so it's kind of notoriously known for bad storms. And if you can imagine being on a yacht, on a sailing yacht, and the wind and the waves and the storm is so great that the boat sort of keels over, it kind of pushes over in that wind and the waves. That's very much what anxiety is like. It's like the wind and the waves of fear, of what we're afraid of for the future. That kind of keels the boat over, and it feels like we're going to go under. It feels like the whole feelings and symptoms related to that kind of push us over. And that's often, the way that's related to me in sessions as well. And so basically fear is a normal response to arousal and usually follows physical responses to the perceived and or real threat. So that's what fear is. Anxiety is an anticipation of future threats that manifest themselves in physical symptoms. So there's a difference between fear and anxiety, in that anxiety is future focused, and fear is kind of now focused, if that makes sense. So these symptoms can be described with anxiety's accelerated heart rate. So when your heart rate actually goes above 100 beats per minute. And I wrote in a blog recently that if you have a heart rate monitor, which you can actually download on smartphones nowadays, you can actually measure how fast your heart rate is. Or if you've got those, Fitbit kind of heart rate monitors on your hand or your arm or whatever, that can measure your accelerated heart rate. And so symptoms like a spike in blood pressure, you can feel dizziness, you can feel fatigue with anxiety, gastrointestinal upset, so your stomach can feel really upset. You can feel general aches and pains as well, muscle tension and spasm. And we'll get into a bit of the detail of anxiety, and that often our back holds anxiety, holds tension. So often people get muscle relaxation through, having massages in their back, because a lot of the times our back holds that anxiety, holds that tension in our back. And then also sweating, so we can basically sweat profusely. Even though there's no reason to sweat, anxiety causes us to sweat because we're getting ready for a physical reaction, and that's what the sweating does. So again, looking at anxiety from a cultural point of view, really, culturally, it's really important to realize anxiety can be put into a cultural context. So in one culture, it might not be abnormal to be anxious about certain things, but in another culture, it's extremely abnormal to do that. So really what we're looking at, and this is the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual 5, that's the DSM-5, basically sort of says, how's your vigilance? So how vigilant are you around a spectrum, and we've got a picture of sort of a bell curve there. And if you kind of look at vigilance, and I'm just using a little bit of an example here, that if you're sort of hyper vigilant, then you're going to be potentially in the abnormal range for your culture. And that's actually what we call an anxiety state. So you might be super vigilant, you might be really jumpy, you might be really concerned about the future of things, which is in the abnormal range. So most people wouldn't be concerned about it, but because you might be concerned about it, that's actually what we class as anxiety. Consequently, people on the other end of the scale are not vigilant at all. So they don't have any within their culture no fear at all when really they should. So I'll give you an example of that. It's like, there's been situations here in Australia where people have gone right up to the top of like really tall trees or power poles, and they've taken selfie photos and completely lost hold of their grip and, fallen and done some serious injuries because people just don't have any vigilance. Often it's a young man's kind of issue, as well as that people are egging each other on to do stupid things. And because there's no vigilance around that, it can be really dangerous. So most of the time people find themselves in this sort of hyper vigilant space up here. And that's sort of why you're doing a course around here, is because you find yourself, in that zone there. But occasionally people, will be here sort of in the present, but then they'll push out into hypervigilance, but then they'll come back, and that's sort of what we're after, is actually coming back into the normal range where you're feeling sort of relaxed and a bit more sort of at ease according to the norm, if that makes sense. So some common diagnoses include specific phobias. Panic attacks are often a symptom or a diagnosis related to anxiety. And then the most common ones, what we call generalized anxiety disorder, where across time your anxiety increases. And then it'll actually be you're anxious about everything, and that can be connected to things like post-traumatic stress, going through experiences which just heighten your anxiety because you've just got so many things happening at once. Again, thinking about that storm and wave analogy, if you keep getting hit by waves and wind, then the boat's going to keel over, and that's a little bit like generalized anxiety disorder in an extremely general way. And like I said right at the bottom here, anxiety overlaps with many other mental health conditions. That's one of the most common in the therapy setting. So just giving you a bit of a cultural context with this one, in Sydney, Australia, pretty much everything that crawls or walks, if it bites you, it'll kill you. So we've got a thing called the funnel web spider, which actually lives in Sydney, Australia. And it's an extremely dangerous little hairy kind of spider. And if you're a native to Sydney, like if you've been born and raised in Sydney, like myself, within my culture, funnel web spiders are not a big deal at all. So, literally, the last person that died of a funnel web spider was about 40 years ago because they've got that much anti venom and things. And this is something that we know when you've been brought up in Sydney, Australia. In our culture, there's no worries about funnel web spiders or taipan snakes or brown snakes, because the chances of getting bitten by one of these, because we're also taught within our culture, just don't go anywhere near these things because they can potentially kill you. So it's like, but then someone who's flying in, say from Sweden or Northern Europe, and they're reading their travel guide, their Lonely Planet guide, so their anxiety around funnel web spiders and brown snakes might be much higher than the average person who's within the Australian culture for their life. So that's just a bit of an example with the cultural context there. Great stuff. So just this one, we're going to talk about specifically the anatomy of anxiety, and hope already this is sort of giving you some help around the anxiety that you might be feeling. And this is sort of giving you a bit of a scientific background to what anxiety is. And so often we use an analogy that, just imagine there's a lion in the room, and this is just an example of what anxiety is. If there's a lion in the room, what do we do? Well, what happens in our brain is we actually have what we call an HBA cycle. So that we have a trigger with our hypothalamus. Actually, first off, it's our amygdala, and then that triggers the hypothalamus, and then it triggers the pituitary gland, and then that sends a message down our brainstem to just above our kidneys to what we call the adrenal glands, and that puts us into a fight, freeze, or flight response. I'll do this actually with another um, example here. This is an app called 3D Brain, and basically just describing that again, just in a little bit more detail, is that in the midbrain, which is this middle part of the brain here, it's like the horseshoe there. What we have is we have something called the amygdala, and that acts like the signal box for anxiety. So that little blue thing there acts like a signal box. It's called the amygdala for anything really dangerous. And so it's almost like a fear monitor that we have inbuilt within us. And so when the amygdala triggers, it actually triggers the hypothalamus, which is just in the middle of that midbrain area. Then triggers the pituitary gland. It's a little dangly thing just down the bottom of the midbrain there. And then that sends message down the brainstem, which is basically in that middle brain bit there. Actually, I'll just show you another picture which shows you the brainstem. Yeah, the brainstem's that blue thing there. So that sends pituitary gland sends message down the brainstem to just above our kidneys to the adrenal glands. And that's what we call the hypothalamus pituitary gland adrenal gland schedule, or HPA schedule. So what does that do? So what it does is it gives us energy in the form of adrenaline, which increases our heart rate, it increases our muscle activity, it increases our oxygen, like our breathing. The cortisol is basically sugar, which gives us energy. And what these things do is give us energy to move into what we call a fight response, a freeze response, or a flight response. So to give you an example, is that imagine there's a lion hypothetically in the room, and we have a fight response. Then what we'll do is we'll attack the lion and try and yeehaw, try and rip the head off the lion and go berserk, and that's what we call a fight response. So we'll move towards a threat in a fight response. And that's kind of a little bit like anger. So anger is a classic fight response. So when we get angry at our friends or neighbors or our relatives, that's because we're feeling threatened. And then we move into a fight response because we're feeling that threat. The second response is a freeze response. So the lion's standing there, we would freeze and play dead, and hopefully the lion would go and find someone more interesting than us to eat. But a freeze response is very common when there's a power differential in relationships. So often abuse cases or situations where there's a power differential, often the weaker person in that power differential, or the perceived weaker person in that power differential, actually has a freeze response. So that's quite common in abuse, sexual assault, those sorts of things, where there's a freeze response which occurs. The third response is what we call the flight response. And basically what will happen is if we perceive a lion's there, we'll just actually run away as fast as we can from the lion. Again, a lion's pretty quick, so good luck with that with us. But what we're doing with the flight response is we're actually avoiding what's causing the stress inside of us. And so if you can see this HPA schedule, it actually forms a real core. It is basically our anxiety response. And so depending on what's inside that amygdala that's going to trigger those fears, actually then sort of sets us up for either, the fight response, a freeze response, and a flight response. Okay. So specifically when we're talking about, well, what is in that amygdala, what we're actually looking at, and this is what we do in the full course going ahead, is we actually sort of detail, what sorts of things occur which store themselves in that amygdala. So often, or what we do know scientifically, is a thing called attachment theory. And attachment is that we form great attachments growing up, and often with our mum and dad and our siblings and our school friends and those sorts of things. But when those attachments break, that can actually create sort of pain, and that pain or fear can then lodge itself in that amygdala. And then that's actually how and why we respond the way we do. So when we get into what we call cognitive behavior therapy, it actually teaches us where those attachment breaks have come from and why we're reacting the way we are. And we get into that detail in the full course going ahead. So, and again, that's really important when it comes to working out, well, where is your anxiety coming from? And so when we're looking at going ahead, we're looking specifically at unraveling the whole thought about what's in that amygdala. Had a client once who said, "Look, can they surgically remove my amygdala?" And I said, "Look, you probably wouldn't want that to happen because you wouldn't be afraid of anything. You'd be on that lower end of the spectrum, not afraid of anything, which is actually really dangerous. But also, you'd probably, not be around because removing the amygdala wouldn't be a cool thing." Let me keep going here. Thanks for that. So yeah, just moving on quickly to anxiety first aid, and very much we're looking at what do we do if our amygdala is firing, our hypothalamus is firing. We're moving. What do we do when we move into an anxiety state? And because we know a little bit about the underpinnings of that anxiety state, I want to move into each of these areas in a specific way and really give you some instruction around if you find yourself in an anxiety state regularly at the moment. These are some of the ways that you can actually manage that anxiety state and sort of get yourself out of it. So the first thing we want to do is physical activity. And it's quite interesting that people, when they come to a psychologist, often the first things we talk about is actually to do physical activity. And we're talking about 3 to 5 sessions a week of actually doing at least 30 minutes a day. And again, check with your doctor, check with your general practitioner if you're able to do those things health-wise. But the reason why we say physical activity is because that adrenaline and cortisol that's exchanged when we have an HPA schedule, it needs to be burnt up. So, like when we're at school, when I was at school in Sydney, growing up, we always had a thing called PE or physical education. It's like going to the gym or, having a run at school regularly. And always notoriously, when people finished school, we just didn't keep up our gym work or we didn't keep up our physical activity. We thought it was just a school thing and we just got into our jobs or our careers or whatever. And the thing about physical activity, it's the number one way that we can manage our stress. And it's the number one way that we burn up that adrenaline and the cortisol. So right now, if you're feeling really anxious, what I really would love you to do is talk to a friend, talk to your partner about how can you get some physical activity going on. Because if you can do that, you'll feel 1,000 times better because some of that adrenaline and that cortisol, a lot of it will be burned up each day. And you'll be able to just feel so much better in your physical body, which then will have an effect in your mental health. So there's a strong link, like I'm saying, between the physical and the mental health aspects with anxiety. And when you're hit with storms and when you hit with those waves, if you can hit the gym and maybe go for a run, get yourself all checked out before you do these sorts of things. But that's actually a really big thing that you can do. Next thing is what we call mindfulness, and it's a little bit hard to see there, but it's basically what it is. And mindfulness is a great way and technique, and it's around the concept of meditation, and you don't have to be religious to do meditation at all. You can also incorporate religion into your meditation or mindfulness. They're actually quite connected as well. So depending on your value system, you can use your prayer time or your meditation time, to help manage your anxiety. But the concept of mindfulness is basically you're viewing your thoughts flowing past you. So it's almost like you're sitting on a deck chair and there's a big wave coming along, and you just watch it wash through you or wash past you. So the concept of mindfulness is that there's some training required to do that. And a couple of things that we do as psychologists straight away to encourage people is in Australia we actually have an organisation called Headspace, and that's actually they have an app which is accessible, I believe, globally, and it actually teaches you mindfulness techniques for free. So there's basically 10 lessons that you can do for free. There's a charge if you want to go further than that, and that goes completely to them. But basically, those 10 steps are a great way to teach you how to stop, how to reflect on your thoughts as separate to yourself, and actually just how you can watch them wash through you, if that makes sense. Another technique that we teach as well is using your 5 senses, so your touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. For each of your 5 senses, you can actually find 5 things. So I'd like you to even stop now, if you'd like to, and stop and just think, what's 5 things that you can see? So when you look around your room or wherever you are listening to this webinar, what are 5 things that you can see? Then the second one is, what are 5 things that you can hear? So again, stopping, pausing, looking around, relaxing, seeing what 5 things that you can hear. Then again, you follow through on the other senses. Smells a bit tricky. Same with taste. You don't want to be licking the bus seat in front of you. That's a bad idea. Um, but basically, and then also touch as well. So no unauthorized touching. Um, but basically, what I'm trying to say with those is, with mindfulness, what you're doing is you're slowing yourself down and you're registering what's happening with your senses, and that's pretty much all you're doing. So it's basically a real way to empty your brain of thoughts, and or allowing just thoughts to flow past you, as opposed to holding on to you and trying to drag you down, if that makes sense. Okay. Next one is healthy eating. There's been a lot of research to say that when we eat healthy, basically that actually increases our mood or makes us feel better. So when I'm talking about healthy eating, whatever your country has a healthy eating schedule. So in Australia, we have a healthy eating triangle. We have all these community branded topics on how to eat healthy. So it's not hard to get information on how to eat healthy. But the reason why physically and psychologically healthy eating is powerful is that serotonin, which is actually a neurotransmitter in our brain, is actually created in our stomach. So when we're eating healthy, we actually feel better. So it's quite unusual, I suppose, but when we're eating healthy food as opposed to junk food or high fat, high carbohydrate food, is that often high fat, high carbohydrate will increase our mood dramatically, and sugar as well, but then it'll make us crash dramatically. So there's no slow release. And so that serotonin goes on a roller coaster ride, but then it can make us crash a lot worse and actually increase our anxiety as well. So it's really important to make sure you're eating healthy. You're getting lots of rest as well, which I haven't put in there, but that's basically something which is very powerful with anxiety. Also, just ahead, like a segue at the moment with anxiety, if that cortisol and adrenaline isn't burnt up during the day, often it wakes us up, and that actually wakes us up in the middle of the night, often between around the 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. space. So if you're finding yourself waking up regularly in the middle of the night, it's because that adrenaline and cortisol isn't being burnt up, and it's actually, affecting your physical body. Again, going back to physical activity, mindfulness, and healthy eating will help all of that as well. The next one is what we call cognitive behavior therapy, and this is in that full course that we're going to talk about, is what specifically is useful with cognitive behavior therapy is really trying to find out what's happened in that amygdala, what's happened in your midbrain to create those fears and anxieties in the first place, and really trying to understand those cognitions, and actually even replacing those cognitions or getting a perspective on those cognitions that actually gives you some framework of what we call empowerment. So when you're empowered to understand what's happening in your own brain because of the way you're brought up, that just can give you incredible freedom and a feeling of empowerment when it comes to your anxiety, because you realize what it is. You realize, okay, because I had a terrible, mummy, daddy growing up situation, that's actually created a fear in me that I feel like I'm abandoned regularly. And so in your relationships, that then creates an abandonment feeling. So once you recognize that or realize that through cognitive behavior therapy, you can start putting measures in place to manage your anxiety around rejection. So I know I said that very quickly then, but that's actually kind of what cognitive behavior therapy does, is it gives us some insight into how we were brought up, what attachments were broken, and then how can we manage that going forwards. Because bottom line with cognitive behavior therapy is that you are not a sum of all your brokenness. That's not who you are. Who you are has got great value, has great potential, and that we're not a sum of all the brokenness that we were brought up with. We're actually something different to that. And even the cognitive behavior therapy component of that actually really is quite a powerful component. Really would love you to check that one out going forwards. Next one is what we call breathing and muscle relaxation. And what we're doing with breathing and muscle relaxation, and this is actually very important with anxiety first aid, is that they're automatic systems that are telling the automatic system of anxiety everything's okay. So it's almost like breathing and muscle relaxation are telling our brain, there's no lion here, that's just a figment of your imagination. So when we talk about breathing and muscle relaxation specifically, what we're actually talking about is what we call 4 and 6, and we call it hold for 5. So I'll just explain those. Is that the Australian Institute of Sport was working out how can they lower the heart rates of their runners and joggers and people doing athletics as fast as possible. So what they did was they developed a technique called breathing in for 4 and out for 6. And that breathing mechanism actually lowers people's heart rate the fastest way possible. So I'd like you to even do that now. Is if you breathe in for 4, 3, 4, and then out for 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and out for 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So when you're practicing that, you don't want to breathe too deeply because you'll pass out. We don't want that to happen. Secondly, it's just a light breathing exercise, and you need to sort of segue it or put in that some muscle relaxation as well. So what we do with that is that we basically tense up each muscle group, and I kind of start with your head and your neck. So you tense that up and you hold it for 5. So I'd like you to do that now. So tense your head and neck. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then loosen it up. So relax it a bit. And then make tense your shoulders and your arms. So hold that for 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just relax that out. And your core, so your chest and your stomach. So hold that for 5, 3, 4, 5. Just relax that out. And then your butt down to your toes. Hold that, tense it up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then do it all again. So you start with your head, shoulders, core, and then your butt down to your toes. And basically, and then segue and push back into that breathing 4 and 6. So breathing in for 4, and then out for 6. So what you'll find with breathing and muscle relaxation, it doesn't happen immediately, but if you give it a good 15 to 20 minutes of just relaxing, breathing, um, and and just sort of even practicing your mindfulness as well, that'll actually lower your anxiety straight away. And that's pretty much been proven again and again in the scientific literature as well. The last one is medication, is that if you're finding yourself in panic attacks regularly, or you're finding yourself in a state of anxiety, generalized anxiety, your general practitioner, so your doctor, will prescribe some medication for you. And there's short-term medications, and they're often called what we call benzodiazepines, which are like Valium or diazepam. They're sort of concepts, not concepts, they're medications that only a general practitioner will prescribe for you, but they'll actually lower your anxiety pretty quickly. The other ones that are tended to be prescribed are what we call SSRIs, which are what they call antidepressants, which might go, well, I haven't got depression, why am I taking these? Well, it's basically a similar system that the anxiety works on with both anxiety and depression. So again, in the full course, we go into medications in quite a lot of detail. But we also have an interview with a general practitioner about what those anxiety medications are. And he goes into a lot of detail and he explains, their impacts on anxiety itself. So yeah, thanks for listening for this bit. So what's next? So again, we're just sort of giving you a bit of a taste about the anatomy of anxiety and about what it is in our brain, literally, and then also the impacts of that from an anxiety first aid point of view. How come first aid for anxiety actually works is because it works on the systems that are creating anxiety as well. So hopefully that's been of value to you, and we want to just switch it up a little bit now and just talk about what's next. And that we've basically got a real special offer for you from this webinar itself, and that within the next 48 hours, you'll actually receive 70% plus off a bundle course value. So what we're offering at Education for Life here is a 2-course bundle just for the price of one. And that price of one is actually at $70 US approximately. It's 99 exactly Australian because we're in Australia. And that includes this course in anxiety, which really forms a basis of all the courses in Education for Life, because the anxiety mechanism underpins many of our psychological mechanisms. This is a real core course that we encourage people to get a hold of. But basically, with that, you get PDFs. There's also what we call a Stripe chat channel, and that basically gives you um, access to chat that you can. Sorry, it's not Stripe. It's called Slack. So sorry about that. A Slack chat channel, and we'll amend that. And basically, that gives you access to us here at Education for Life. You can ask as many questions you like on that, with also the rest of the people doing the course as well. So there'll be lots of chat to and fro with that, which will be very good. It's called Slack, not Stripe. So apologies about that. It's a new one for me, and I'm just getting used to it. So the individual course that we actually sell at Education for Life is $187 Australian, which is about $138 US. And so two of these courses is actually working out to be 276 US dollars. So we're actually giving you that if you purchase within the next 48 hours, a $70 cost for that. So that's actually quite good value. We think it's great value, and hopefully it'll be a value to you. Again, each course is around about 5 hours of video material, and that's from professional psychologist team here in Sydney. Much of it will be myself, but there'll be other people as well involved. And normally we actually charge $246 an hour Australian to do a face-to-face appointment. So another value proposition that we put out there is that Australian dollar wise, 10 hours worth of video is worth about 2,400 Australian dollars. It's around about 1,800 US dollars, all for $70. And so we're thinking that's pretty good value. Plus you get that Slack chat channel there, not the Stripe one, the Slack one. And hopefully that's great value to you as well. And so the value you'll receive, is basically you'll get with this Overcoming Anxiety course, you'll have the anatomy of anxiety, you'll have that anxiety first aid, you'll have all the treatments in anxiety, what medications are useful. Like I said, we'll have our GP coming in and doing an interview on that. We're going to specifically tailor lots of modules around that cognitive behavior therapy. So go into a reasonable amount of detail with CBT and just explain how that CBT works specifically, and that way you can tailor it to your own situation. There's lots of references that will pour into that, so there's lots of extra readings and things that you can do to help you nail that as well. We're also going to talk about mindfulness and how powerful that is. And again, like I said, tailoring that to your value system is really important as well. And you'll have a Slack online chat login as well, and any questions, and engage in the group in discussion there. So just a plus the other courses that we actually have at Education for Life, and these include basically a course on anti-bullying, or how to stop bullying. We've got a course on how to have a healthy relationship, or relationships and parent well. So that relates to kids and also relationships. We've got a course on dating as well, which is really cool. And so that's just, again, the psychology behind dating. It's not how to manipulate, it's not how to do any of that kind of stuff, but it's just basically how is a proven method to date well. Because we've often found in psychology, and again in our face-to-face appointments, there's a lack sometimes in information, just practical information on how to date well. We've had many people get married actually through the years. They've been practicing and just applying those lessons, and hopefully haven't got it confirmed yet, but hopefully getting some interviews with some of those people that have gone through that method and how it worked for them. We're going to do a course on overcoming depression, and again, that's an extension of the anxiety. And a very common thing in our culture as well at the moment is depression and anxiety. And so that's a great course, a trauma rehabilitation course. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of stuff with trauma rehabilitation, and some interesting information around that on how to process trauma and how to process those sorts of painful events going on. We've also, and this is an interesting one, have got a basics of financial management course. And often we find in sessions is that people have a lot of anxiety when it comes to finance and about how to make ends meet, and the future. So anxiety relates to fear of the future. And so often just a basic financial plan can be really powerful. And it's a simple course. I'm not a financial manager at all. But we're going to have an interview with somebody there in financial management, but also just talk about some real basics, which hopefully you can apply to your culture as well. We're going to talk about addictions and what we've found in sessions again. People are getting flooded at the moment with pornography imagery, and often, in particular, males, but also females, are finding it very difficult to stop the addiction of pornography. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of psychology in that particular course on how to stop an addiction to pornography specifically. You can, with addiction therapy, you can actually push that out into other addictions like alcohol addiction and drug addiction as well, because some of the things that underpin addiction are similar to each kind of area. But we're going to specifically focus on the pornography addiction, and how to overcome that one, how to get better on that one. So how to have a healthy marriage as well, which is a real great course and there's some phenomenal research that's in particular come out through Dr. John and Julie Gottman in Seattle. And so we're going to be spending some good time in that course around healthy marriages, and then also overcoming grief. How do we overcome grief? How do we process grief? It's probably another way to put it. Yeah, and just pointing that out. Now, again, really wanted to point out that this offer of $70 US roundabout, plus for 2 courses, is going to expire in 48 hours. So really want you to click on the link to purchase these offers. Also, just in the fine print there, that many of these courses are in pre-release, which also reflects the price that we've got. And because we're basically starting up this online education in 2018, that's what we're doing. But all the courses will be released in full by the 31st of December this year. So just putting that as a promise there and a pledge. Otherwise, you'll get complete money back, and that's to the 31st of December 2018. Also, with our purchases, there is always a 30-day money-back guarantee as well. So if you're not happy at all with anything that's going on with the courses, you'll have a full money-back guarantee for 30 days for that. So any questions about all that, again, get onto your Slack chat channel if you purchased the course, and we can talk through all those, or you can email us on info@educationforlife.com.au. And thanks again for listening. Hope it's been of good value to you.